So, Tony, what you and I know that anyone watching this video doesn't know is that we've already started this conversation once, and then there's been a meltdown of computers, and it didn't work, and we've come back in. And the reason I mention that is because I really don't want to do it all again because it gets so false. Because the whole point of these conversations is to make them genuine. So I had started us off by saying, well, I think actually the first thing was that I noticed that by looking at my camera, I could see two of your books on my shelf, which in the break while you've been sorting out the computers, I've picked up. Here's your one on death. Here's your one on the daemon. I think there's some others as well. So the reason I mention those, apart from the books you've written, they're great, is that for me, what motivates me behind writing all these books is my own search for meaning, to make sense of this thing we're in. And you had started telling me that it was very similar for you, and I would like you to try and pick up on that theme, because that's what I'd like to explore with you, really.
Yeah, it's one of these things that I think as writers we don't write for fame. We definitely don't write for fortune, because that just doesn't happen. What we write for is because we want to get our ideas out there, but in many ways we use it as a self-reference, because what we're really doing is trying to understand ourselves as to who we are, what we are in a seemingly mindless universe that seems to not be attuned to us in any shape or form. You know, the idea that there's this endless universe that seems to go on forever, and in terms of we are a tiny link in a genetic chain, or are we more? And if we are more, you know, we need to very quickly try to understand what that is in the very short time that we have the opportunity to do so. And this is what I've been doing all through my life, and my writing is just, it's everything about me. It's to do with trying to understand. And if other people are along for the ride, that is brilliant. And if my writing resonates with other people, that is wonderful. But really, it is my journey and my understanding. And funnily enough, it's really wonderful to be talking to you, because many people out there will probably not be aware of this. But without you and without your writing, I'd never even started. Because many years ago, way back in probably, I can't remember now, probably about 1998, 99, my mother-in-law bought me a book, The Jesus Mysteries. And I took it on holiday with me to a place in the Peloponnese in Greece, and a place called Stupa. And while I was there, I read the book. And although I had started researching my first book, when I got home, I started to rewrite it again, because I discovered the concept of the daemon for the first time in your wonderful book. And it so resonated with me. And then when we were in subsequent contact, it was even better, because, you know, and to be talking to you now as somebody that I wouldn't have become a writer without that reference. I think the daemon was the thing, particularly the Gnostic concept, as you describe in the book, was what made so much sense to me and put it all into perspective. And suddenly all the pieces fell into place, you know, and it's almost that kind of, as I call it, synchronidity. You know, it's kind of synchronicities that just happen for a reason. And now we're friends, and we've shared platforms together, and it's absolutely wonderful the way life just works out in terms of that.
So what was it about that, Tony? What was it about the daemon that resonated then and still for you?
I think it was I was struggling to understand, in terms of when we live our lives, what is the guiding voice that seems to bring about inspiration, seems to bring about pointing us in a particular direction rather than another. And I was intrigued as to not only what that voice was, but how it knew the things it knew. And it was only when, particularly in your writing, you pointed out that there is the daemon, which is the higher self in Gnostic belief systems, but there's also the eidolon, which is the everyday personality that exists within what I now argue is possibly the simulation. And it was those two factors together. Had you written about the eidolons, or had you just written about the daemon, I think I wouldn't have really got it. It wouldn't have really made sense to me. But it was the kind of the partition of consciousness that particularly intrigued me. And of course, a few years later, I then started reading the Philip Pullman books and his concept of the daemon, which clearly is Gnostic, but he never ever mentions the concept of the eidolon. You know, he has daemons as these kind of entities or creatures that follow somebody around in animal form and everything else, and then before puberty they move around and they change.
I've never thought this. I've never asked myself from the Pullman idea. It's like, do you see your daemon as having an animal form? Could it have an animal form? If it did,
we have, myself and my group, we've discussed this over many years, and we definitely conclude that probably it may not have necessarily an animal form, but it tends to be the opposite sex of what you are. I tend to come to the conclusion, and many people have backed me up on this, that if you're male, your daemon tends to be female, and vice versa. Whether this is in fact correct is beside the point, but it seems to work for me in terms of that. Because I don't know if you know, but there's a guy called Myron Dial that I've worked a lot with, and Myron manifested his daemon when he was 4 years of age. And since then, this entity has been guiding him, talks to him, takes him to altered states of consciousness, takes him to another location, which is known as Zelkon, where he goes when he experiences temporal lobe epilepsy. So when he goes into fugue states or when he goes into aura states, this is where he goes. And funnily enough, I'm doing an event in California at the end of May, and only a few days ago I received a very excited phone call from one of the co-founders of the event. It's called Contact in the Desert, and she was particularly excited because she literally had just, checking me out, had read the book The Daemon literally last weekend, and because her daemon has been manifesting all her life, she was so excited she needed to talk to me about it. Now clearly both you and I are fascinated by the whole Gnostic worldview, the idea of the pleroma and the canoma and the reality behind the reality. But it really was your work that made that happen, and
I definitely feel that that my process, I mean, the last period of 10, 15 years, whatever, has been increasingly about a philosophical understanding which can enlarge and incorporate my actual direct experiences. And one of the puzzling things to me is I have to work from the inside out. I wish I was someone who could do research, but I have got this completely back to front way of working, whereby I just walk with my daemon. I just walk with, and I put the questions and I wait for the replies, and then I question the replies like mad and push them. It's not like revelation, but it's definitely like, and I'm looking for that moment where the thing comes and it just goes, oh, there, that, follow that, what's that? And then the next thing, and then and it used to take sometimes months, and now it takes hours, and it just moves. It's so exciting, but it's like an interchange, and then only then can I go and read whatever it is I'm thinking about and find out, oh yeah, they've already said all of this, and this is very similar, and it's all back to front for me. And because I don't know what I'm looking for in the research until I've actually made the journey on the inside.
I'm with you totally on that, in that it seems that, and if you agree or disagree with my overall hypothesis of cheating the ferryman, the idea that the daemon has lived your life before and therefore can guide you because it's already followed the path, or has followed many paths in your life, and it is there to say, okay, Nick, this time round, I want Tim to take this route, and I need to give him some gentle nudges or inklings to move him in that direction. Because I find it's very similar in my own writing, in that I will be guided by the inner voice, by the daemon, to read certain things in certain ways, but it'll point me to them. It'll either use incredible synchronicities, or it will just, as I said, synchronidity. It will create a set of circumstances whereby my attention will follow a certain path, and I know that at the end of that path will be a pot of gold. There'll be a treasure. There'll be something there, and the daemon is saying, I've got to get you on this route now, because I know where the intersection is going to take place in 6 months or a year's time, but I have to get you there and position you in this location. And in this, I'm reminded of Rudyard Kipling. And in Kipling's famous, well, it's not necessarily famous, but his autobiography, Something of Me, he discusses his own daemon. There's one famous statement where he turns around and he says, you need to wait for your daemon to speak. And when the daemon speaks, you follow his guidance. because he had a series of incidents in his life. He argued that most of his stories, and indeed nearly all of his short stories, were created by his daemon. He just was a dictator. He dictated the information. But the daemon showed incredible future knowledge. And it's something, as you know, I've written a book on J.B. Priestley, and Priestley used the term FIP, future influencing past, because there was one particular case where he had written a short story called The Old Men of Pevensey, which is in, I think it's Peake of Pook's Hill, which is a series of stories for children he wrote. And in it, he bases the story in Pevensey Castle in Kent. It's like, I always get it wrong. I think it's Kent rather than East Sussex, during the time of the Norman invasions. And he has two characters, the two old men of Pevensey Castle, and they're in a tower within Pevensey Castle, and they have a treasure with them, and they can't get out. And like most writers, he had painted himself into a corner in terms of the plot, because he didn't know how he was going to get his characters to escape. And he goes walking in his garden in his house in Bateman's in Sussex, and the daemon comes to him, and the daemon turns around to him and says, what you need to do is to have a sea well inside the tower. And they discover the sea well. They knock at a wall and they find that there's something, they sound the wall and they realize that the wall is not solid. They break down the section and they find a sea well that goes down to the moat. They jump down there, they find a little boat and they escape. But as Kipling said to the daemon, met in his mind, he said, but there isn't this in the castle. And the daemon just said, go ahead with the story. He then subsequently discovered around about 8 or 9 years later that the seawall, the actual sea, the tower, the actual sea thing that he had described was found in the very tower he placed the storyline. And as he said, I said, but I didn't know that at the time. It was only my future self that knew that. And this leads you to believe that your daemon is your own future self, or is your own self, your guiding spirit. As you say in your books, it's the you that is your guide that the gods have given you from the start. You just need to listen.
So there's a whole load of fascinating things you've said, which is what I love about talking to you, Tony, because you're full of interesting perspectives. Numbers of which I disagree with. So I don't know where we should go, which one to explore, because they're all about how we make sense of this. And I could be misunderstanding, and that's why I part of me just goes, I'm not sure about that. So there's a whole thing about the future, whether what's happening there, because something's happening there. I'm not sure. Well, I've got some ideas myself about what that might be, but there's that. You just dropped in passing that this might be a simulation, which is a fucking enormous idea, and another idea that I don't resonate in the way of a simulation, but I'm very interested in exploring. And then the other thing is about the idea of, there's what's the daemon? We started on that. That's a huge thing. Or as in Soul Story, I've started calling it the genius, the Latin version, just because of the way we use that word these days. And then there's the stuff about death, and obviously they all link in, although they're all quite different ideas, really, aren't they? There's the idea that one of your particularly I think of as particularly around yourself that I don't know that I've heard anywhere else actually. Is this idea that the eternal recurrence in one's own life, and that you were saying the daemon has lived your life before. My own sense is the daemon has lived other lives before, in the sense that it's the deepest part of the psyche, the soul, which has had other things. On the face of it, I find the idea that it's lived Tim's life before, a combination of being a little bit soul destroying, a little bit like, really? And kind of impossible to actually get my head around how you imagine that could work, the mechanics of that. It's like, so we've had this conversation before, or it like, does do you, because it's either Groundhog Day, either it's just a repeat, in which case it doesn't seem to serve any purpose, or it's Groundhog Day, in which each one of us is learning or growing or changing. But the thing that I find logistically hard to gain, but there's the issue of does it make sense? But there's the logistic side of it. It's just like, well, one slight change and everything is different.
Oh yeah.
And so that, or I'm a puppet in your universe, or conversely, you're a puppet in mine. I don't get how that can work, really.
Okay. The first thing is the evidence from science. Okay. And the evidence in terms of, first we'll approach the simulation argument.
They're linked?
Yeah, they're linked. Yeah, precisely.
Okay.
Okay. The first thing is in terms of...
Before, actually, I want to stop you. Is it possible, because I really want to go there, but before, because there's a whole load of stuff around the simulation which will open up, and I just worry we'll end up going into that. But before we do that, just this issue of just the very basic idea of that, the fact that if we are changing, how can we live the same lives? That the minute it starts off, it would be completely different. I mean, just one trajectory that changed would mean a different everything. And the creativity, if the universe is creative at all, and certainly if we have any creativity, how would it possibly be the same life?
Well, the continuity is the daemon. So the continuity is the immortal part of you that has lived the life many, many times. But the daemon, I always use the analogy of Groundhog Day is a very good analogy in terms of the movie. And in fact, on my own podcast, I've actually interviewed Danny Rubin, the guy that wrote Groundhog Day. But the idea is that in order for something to evolve, for something to move on, for me, you have to learn from your mistakes. You have to be aware of the things you did wrong in some subliminal way last time you lived this life. You know, the idea that we all make mistakes in our lives, and wouldn't it be wonderful if we were in the scenario that somehow you could put those mistakes right? You could be aware or in some way of making...
But in Groundhog Day, it only happens to one person.
Yes.
Because everyone else is just doing the same thing. They're kind of...
Well, no, they're not. And this is the interesting thing, isn't it? Because if you think a moment's recollection of the Groundhog Day movie really is very similar to your own argument here, that every time that Connor's made a different decision, he changed the lives of everybody else.
Yeah, that is true.
You know, everybody else's lives changed as well.
It's more that it's like, or certainly to begin with, he was, he realized it was the same, and he was waking up on the same day. Now, my problem is, he wakes up on the same day. So what is the same day? Is it like the moment of my birth is the same each time? But then after that, God only knows?
No, it can take it back even further than that, because there's been a whole myriad of decisions made by your parents, your grandparents, your great-grandparents as to where you are located. Now, there is growing evidence that the universe is digital in the way it is programmed, and that it is made effectively of information. And again, this is not my hypothesis. This is the hypothesis of some of the world's leading quantum physicists, including people like Craig Hogan at the Perimeter Institute. And these individuals, and I'm thinking Juan Maldacena, and specifically a guy called Jacob Bekenstein, who died last year, I think it was, who's an Israeli quantum physicist. And these guys are really coming to the conclusion that at its base level, the universe is information, and that consciousness in some way is related to I suppose, to what use a quantum term, the collapse of the wave function of that particular reality. Now, again, before he died...
hang on a second, Anthony.
Okay.
By the way, I'm absolutely with you in terms of I think I just wanted to just divide the idea that this is the best way to understand this is through the concept of information, which I absolutely get, and the idea that therefore it's been programmed. Those are two quite different ideas.
Well, yeah, but let's just roll back slightly again. Towards the end of his life, Stephen Hawking wrote a series of papers with a guy called Frank Hartle, who is a researcher at CERN. And they come up with a conclusion they call the top-down hypothesis of quantum physics. And the top-down hypothesis of quantum physics extrapolates from the idea that the act of measurement, ergo the act of observation, if you want to extract from there, collapses a potentiality of reality, i.e. a statistical chance that the subatomic particles will be located in one place or another. The act of measurement or the act of observation collapses those potentialities into an actuality. And we're doing this all the time. So what he argued was that every potential outcome of every decision is already encoded within the 0 point field, the mega hologram, whatever we want to call it, the mind of God, whatever we want to call it. But they are already in potentiality. And each consciousness collapses the particular wave function to accommodate what they're looking at or what they are perceiving.
Oh,
Now,
this is what is lovely. We just got to roll with it, because it's like, yeah, because we're gonna have to go back and pick up this again. I just want to divide. I mean, look, quantum physics has obviously been a mystery for 100 years and very, very interesting. I'm not at all sure that many physicists are saying that it's involved with consciousness doing anything. Personally, I'm not at all convinced it's consciousness doing anything, but certainly it does look like that on a very primitive level, we can understand this as information, which is potential information, which will become actualized when or specified. So, but what you're looking at there, it feels to me, is not like, decisions leading to this. It's more like on a very, very primitive level, you have what could be best described by mathematical probability wave functions becoming something which can be best described by different sets of equations which are specific to space-time. So that transition, how that transition happens is, of course, there's some numbers of very, very interesting theories, none of which have been fully accepted widely, but the jump to it's being done somehow by the observer in terms of it being conscious seems like a big, big jump to me.
It's not a jump I'm making. It's a jump that's been made by some of the world's leading physicists. I cite the example, for instance, of John Archibald Wheeler.
But Wheeler backtracked on it.
Towards the end of his life, did he?
Yeah, as did and the guy who he backtracked from that, so that it was about interaction with other. It's like the thing which for me, when I look at that whole question, what it seems it feels like, look, the whole universe. The description for me of this simple description would be it's the one in relationship to itself, and it's. So there's obviously it's one thing, but it's constantly many things, and everything, right down to the simplest wave function, right the way up to an elephant, is interrelating with the rest. So that sense that everything is a subject and an object, everything, even the wave function, means that when something which functions on a probability level encounters something which doesn't, which is on a more emergent level, and or it may be still a probability, but it's much more, it's like, this may still be a probability, but it's so likely to stay my hand that every time I look away, it's hand. Oh, there it is, hand. It's so that
That's a good point.
So the actuality is increasing, which I think that's what one of the things Wheeler was saying. So that really what's happening is that it's the meeting of subject and object, which is happening on every level of reality, which is fashioning something definite from something which couldn't be anything. Well, on the lowest level, on the base level, we might be able to say it could be anything. But by the time it gets to the quantum level, it's not anything. It's just like, well, it could be there or it could be there. It's like the particles.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, because it's to do with the location in space-time.
Yeah, so it comes into space-time through interaction. I think that's where Wheeler ended up. I'm not a physicist, so I may be wrong. But that's my sense.
Neither am I. But as I understand it, the idea is there seems to be, and from my latest readings of papers in quantum physics, there still seems to be this issue of what stimulates the collapse of the wave function. To argue that an act of observation or an act of measurement or anything else brings about the collapse of a wave function means that there's some form of agency involved here.
Not necessarily.
And what agency is.
Why is that true? Well, I wonder whether, I think the whole idea of the collapse is a particular language which, came in with Niels Bohr, wasn't it? Or one of those early people. And we've kind of been left with this idea that there's a wave function and collapses. But actually what we've got is a mathematical equation. And then we've got something specific, which is still mathematical. I mean, it's still not like a thing you can hold. And it's a transition of a mathematical equation, which is a probability equation, to a mathematical, which is something definite. And so that points to something, like you said, interesting. It means that we're dealing with on a very low level. This is not definite. It's more malleable. And things like the quantum erasers suggest that might go up quite high.
Yeah.
You know, but still, that's the transition. But if everything is, if we let go of this, is one of the ideas in Soul Story that I really found very powerful to work with, is to get rid of the idea of there being either an objective universe or it being all subjective, like a lot of the spiritual traditions. It's all in consciousness, but instead get it to be an interactive universe, a relational universe, where everything is in relation, and what exists is always the relationship. So what exists now is a bit like Alfred Whitehead, an occasion. This is this event, but this is the interaction of the universe and Tim. And then, but there's also the interaction of the universe and the parts that make up the table, and the interaction of the garden with the plants, and everything is interacting, and that interaction of subject and object, of which everything is both, is what the universe is. So that, of course, when a probability wave function interacts with something to measure it, which is something on a more emergent level, it now there is no probability wave function on its own. Actually, it becomes something definite when it's only ever in reaction, in response. I'm not sure I explained that particularly well. Did that make some sense?
No, it did. No, it's an interesting idea. It is still the issue of the question of, and this is going to get incredibly deep, and I always know that when we get conversations like this, it's going to get incredibly deep. The idea of the role of whatever a sentience is, whatever it is that's doing the observing. I'm sitting here now in my library, and I know I'm something observing something. I know that the only thing I actually know with any certainty is that I'm some form of observer of stimuli that's taking place. But other than that, I have no real genuine idea of exactly what I am. All I know is that something is processing something. So my brain, if we take the classic example from materialist reductionism, and even from modern science, is the idea that in some way my sensory apparatus is bringing in external stimuli through my eyes, through my somatosensory situation, through my ears and everything else, and is taking that data and creating an internal model within my brain of what the external reality is. But that is, again, a facsimile of what may or may not be out there.
Okay, so I want to come against that idea.
Okay.
Because it's obviously a very, very common one. I'm constantly hearing, especially in science, like, oh, you're creating the world with your brain. What's really out there is quantum particles, and then you create this world. Obviously, that's the whole reductionist thing, which for me is so superficial. The whole the reductionism is, I'm sure we would agree, is like a complete dead end. So I take an emergentist view, which is that the whole process, this creative process, is becoming more or building on itself, and new aspects of reality are emerging. So through that, so that what I'm looking at, it feels to me, is not a representation in my brain. What I'm looking at is the world, because what exists is me in relationship to it, and that's what this is. That there's no representation going on. This is it. This is the world. I'm touching the world. I'm meeting you. This is my body on this level of emergence. Go back down another level and you'll find lots of empty space and atomic atoms buzzing around. Go back to that, you'll find probabilities. They're all real. Everything's unfolding into greater emergence. And on this level of biological sensory perception, this information, which is my body, meets the world, and this is what exists. And it's not some representation, it's actually the world. And then it will move on to a completely different level, which is the psyche or the soul or the pleroma, the non-material domain, which we're having this conversation. And that's another thing again, and they're all real and more emergent. So I'm not sure we need to posit the whole qualia, the brain is creating a facsimile. It feels like this is the way I perceive what's actually there. And as I perceive it, something new comes into reality. With the eyes came red, for instance. That kind of idea.
So it's kind of the reverse. It's something that I interviewed recently. I can't think of his name now. Consciousness studies expert, Max Velmans. And Max has a fascinating theory that we've got it the other way around, in that that the external world is fed outwards from us rather than us taking it in. It's rather like, when he was describing it, I was reminded of, those famous line drawings, either done by Descartes or discussing Descartes' ideas, where the idea of the act of observation, the information flows outwards. So my brain thinks of something, and then, oh, shoot, my battery is about to go. Can you just give me 2 seconds?
Yeah,
I just
of
need
course.
to go and plug it in.
No problem.
Okay. And so I suppose you can edit out that problematic situation. Okay.
So you were talking about this, the idea that we're projecting the world out. So there's two ideas there. One is we create the world. One is we project the world. I'm saying personally, neither of those. What I'm saying is kind of really common sense. I'm saying we meet the world, and where we meet, this appears, that everything is that. There is no world. There's only the world as being met by part of itself, because there's only the one in relationship to itself, and everything's relational. Time is relational, space is relational, everything is relational, and including subject and object. So that what I'm experiencing is the relationship between the information on all the levels of emergence, which is my window and my garden, as I'm looking out the window here, and this particular organic form and how it can receive light, for instance. And that the interaction of the two is I'm seeing what's there. There's no creation of anything. It's just like, there it is, I'm meeting it. And then, as I said, then we deal with the psyche, which is a completely different thing, because that's obviously a non-material forms.
But if we take, say, if you look at the brain and you do an fMRI scan of somebody observing something, you do find that there is an inner creation. There's certain parts of the brain fire. For instance, when somebody plays tennis, and this is an interesting point, isn't it? When somebody plays tennis and they do an fMRI scan of the brain, certain parts of the brain light up, which is indicating that the person is doing the actions. And then when you ask somebody to then think about doing the actions, the same parts of the brain light up, which means there's a direct one-to-one relationship between actually physically doing something and thinking about doing something, which rather supports your point of view on that, doesn't it? The idea that it's a far closer relationship. So how do you account for things such as, I don't know, entheogens, dimethyltryptamine, psychedelics, these kind of things? What, within that scenario, what is happening when somebody takes a psychedelic substance and goes into altered states of consciousness?
Okay, so the big jump for me, and this comes back to the work I did on the Gnostics, actually, and it was a resurgence of that came back to me and started me off on this philosophy I've been following for a while, which I kind of see as a neo-Gnosticism, but it turns the Gnosticism on its head, in a sense. Mm-hmm. Because it's rather than the whole spiritual idea of always a fall or emanation and coming down into the lower, I'm very, very attracted for all sorts of reasons to the idea of the emergence and evolution of reaching up to the higher. Anyway, there's various reasons for that. So the big jump for me was, the thing I got from the Gnostics was, oh, look, you're experiencing a flow of sensation and a flow of imagination. And that's the body and the soul. And this experience we're having of the psyche or the soul, this is not a side effect. It's a whole realm. It exists. So we can have the kenoma or the pleroma or any names you want to give that, but there's an imaginal realm and there's a sensory realm. And I'm in both. And I'm experiencing both. And then there's what's their relationship. So the relationship which I'm exploring is that the imaginal realm has evolved from the sensory realm, but it is not dependent on it. It's not a byproduct of it. It's a whole level of emergence in its own right, which has come from being conscious of images. So that once consciousness has arisen and you've got consciousness of sensation, then you've got the possibility to be conscious of the past And if I'm conscious of the tree I saw yesterday, it's not a tree, it's an image of a tree. So you've got a whole world beginning to arise and evolve, which is populated by images, with then images of images, ideas, concepts, and blah, 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 until now what you and I live in is this massive, extraordinary realm, which if you take certain chemicals, and the last time I did it, I had probably the most profound experience I've ever had in my life. And the insight which came actually just after the experience was, and I'm not saying this is always true, Tony, this is just maybe true, seemed at the time an interesting idea, was I thought, oh, these are poisons. I'm intoxicated. These are toxins. And what's happening is the link between what for me is two distinct levels of information, the biological level and the psychological or the soul level, two levels of information, which are like this right now, which do this at death, and in the psychedelic experience kind of do that, so that all of the, my attention was so far away from my body that I was catapulted into these other realms, as you know. So and experience their depths. So the thing that I'm following is that the idea you said, information, it's evolving information, but that each level of emergence has its own reality. That on this reality, it's this. And then on this reality, it's what we're experiencing. It's also this. And then there's a subject and object relationship. So the psyche is no longer the subjective side of the body. That seems to be prevalent in science. It's not at all. It feels like, no, the subjective experience of the body is sensation. The subjective experience of the soul is imagination. And there's an objective level to the imagination as well. And you can go off into that objective realm and explore it. In fact, I think we're doing it right now as we share objective ideas.
Because this is interesting, because all the time when you were discussing that, I was reminded of the work of Henri Corbin and the idea of the imaginal.
Yeah.
And particularly the way that the Sufis actually see this as a concept of the imaginal is something that is outside of us and independent of us in some way, and it's a place we can inhabit and move into. Now, again, when you were saying that, there was something really fascinating there, and it stimulated my ideas on this, is that, I don't know if you know, but there's a group of researchers at the moment at Imperial College that are doing research into DMT. The money's being put up, I think, by Anton Bilton, the multimillionaire. And there's a group of researchers, and under controlled conditions, they're taking intravenously, they're taking DMT and then reporting back their experiences, because they're trying to almost map the DMT realm, the Terence McKenna idea of machine elves and everything. And one of the researchers I'm working with, not working with, but I'm associated, is a friend of mine. He had a very curious experience, which vindicates what you've just said, whereby he took the DMT intravenously, found himself in the DMT zone, and when he's in the DMT space, an entity comes over to him and says, please do not do this way. This is the wrong way to do it. You are not doing it in the right way. Please do not do it like this. He then finds himself coming to, and 2 weeks later, he then takes the DMT again, finds himself in the same location, and the very same entity came over and said exactly the same thing. It said, this is not the way to do it, suggesting that the entity had a sense of independence from him. So in other words, it wasn't just a creation of his subconscious, because it was telling him something he didn't want to hear. But more importantly, that the entity was saying that the route you are taking to enlightenment, the route you are taking to coming into my world, almost, almost shamanic. And the point you were making there is almost shamanic, isn't it? In terms of the upper, the lower, and the middle world. And it said it's wrong. Now, I think your point is a very valid one here, because and we could have a discussion about this, that if you actually take entheogens of any description, your experience is not as valid, because you're not going there with a map, you're not going there as being trained, you're almost being catapulted into this place. And it's dangerous, effectively, isn't it? It's like somebody doing a shamanic journey without having shamanic training and wandering around in the upper world or the lower world, not knowing where they're going.
Well, I mean, it's interesting, because I did have an experience last year where I did that, and I did it because I was with a shaman, and because I'd done something comparable 15 years ago. I've been experimenting with these things all my life, and from that experience, I'd come to exactly that conclusion, Tony. I'd gone, I'm never doing this without somebody who knows what they're doing, because these things are strong. So where do we get to? So we were playing with. Where did we get to? We've covered so many things.
We have.
Where should we pick up on? We have the idea of it being information. Let's go for that. Come on, let's focus this month. So you said early on that we both agreed information is a great category. There's a lot we could say on that, but we agree. So let's go. The bit I never go for is that leads to the idea of simulation. Now, I really like computer metaphors. It feels to me like, Newton's time was the time of the great machines. The universe became a great machine. That's natural and helpful. Now we're living in the time of information technology. It's the information age. So the universe is information. It's really helpful. But it's a big jump to start calling it a simulation of something rather than its own self. And how does it help?
Yeah, your point is a valid one. And there's one, as a trained historian in terms of myself and everything else as well, a sociological historian, that clearly the ideas and the technology around you will necessarily create the framework whereby you will interpret the world around you. And of course, yes, the mechanistic universe, of course, we'd have the original universe of the medieval doctors and everything else as well, and the medieval
animistic universe before that.
So we have the theory of Thomas Kuhn and the theory of revolutions and everything. But effectively, what this does is it creates a framework whereby we can understand in some way the reality around us. And I very much take your point that now, because we now understand the concept of digitization, we understand the concept of simulation in the sense of virtual reality simulations, that suddenly we're going to be jumping on that bandwagon. It's not necessarily jumping on a bandwagon, but it's a way of using something as a tool for understanding of what might be an ultimate reality. Now, I think when people use the arguments of the simulation idea, I think it can be misinterpreted as if there is some kind of, it's running on some kind of computer or something like that. I think it's more
simulation of what?
A simulation, that reality itself is some form of simulation.
What's it simulating?
It's simulating itself.
What's it copying?
That's an interesting point in terms of a simulation by very implication suggests a copy.
Yeah.
Let's go back one step as to why a lot of the researchers are coming to this conclusion, and why the people like Craig Hogan and Mal DeCarner and everybody. And it's all to do with what really is reality out there. What is the template that reality is running upon? What is there, just a three-dimensional universe out there? And as a philosopher, the big debates over the centuries over even space, and the idea if you didn't have objects in space, I can't remember who it was now, was it Hegel? I can't remember the guy that said that, Mach, wasn't it? And the idea that if you didn't have objects in space, there would be no space, because the objects are the things that relate space to each other. And if there's no objects, there isn't anything. So the idea is, why is there anything rather than nothing? Is the first billion-dollar question as to why, and why it seems to be within a three-dimensional framework that everything exists within. And then it's the idea of, how has it come to pass? How has it come into existence? Why is it out there? And the simulation argument is suggesting that in some way it is created out of information, and it's holographic in some type of form. And I think, again, I know Stephen Hawking was quite fascinated by these implications towards the end of his life. And he was particularly interested in the idea of information being lost out of an enclosed system. For example, if the universe is an enclosed system, and I went to the edge of a black hole and I threw my iPad into the black hole, technically information would be lost, which then contravenes the second law of thermodynamics, that things get converted into something else, but they're never lost. And he concluded that there should be some form of radiation leakage out of a black hole, which has become known as now as Hawking radiation, and that this leakage is the information of objects that have been sucked into the black hole. So, for instance, and again, it's to do with relativity. It's the relative viewpoint of, if I fall into a black hole, I will sense falling into a black hole, but from an observer's point of view, I will be smeared on the edge of the black hole. And the idea is that everything that has ever existed and can ever exist in some way is smeared out on the edge of the expanding universe. The idea is, for instance, imagine the universe as it is now, 13.
When you said with the whole holographic universe idea, so do you, when you said anything that has happened or could have, did you say that has happened? We're talking about the future as well?
This is again when we're talking about Hawking's top-down hypothesis.
Right.
And the top-down hypothesis is that, again, going back to everything being in some way already encoded into whatever we're talking about here. And the idea that, as we were saying before, whether the collapse of the wave function takes place or not, and of course we could then counter argue, the collapse of the wave function doesn't take place because, there could be the many worlds interpretation that says that the collapse of the wave function never happens and it just continues forever. But the idea that in some way everything that can happen and will happen already exists in this kind of timeless, Julian Barber called Platonia, this kind of place outside what we'd recognize, I suppose, as the pleroma, using a Gnostic term. And everything that can exist exists in there and is then created or programmed within this, as we have a time flow, that the idea that there's a time flow. But in fact, there's a timeless place where everything just is.
That seems such a ridiculously complicated idea to me. I'm always looking for the simplest solution.
No, applying Occam's razor and applying Occam's razor.
That just feels like, really? So and what difference does that make? Isn't that just basically going what we already know, which is potentially it's anything, but it's right now it's this. And we also know that what it will become is something which incorporates all of this, but will be different. And that it could, it's like, do we really need to go to those places?
Well, it's going to the ultimate question of philosophy, isn't it? As to why is there something rather than nothing? Why, surely, if the most simple form is the most natural form, why does anything exist in the first place?
I use the word potential in Soul Stories, going, look, what do we, taken actually from Brian Swim, the cosmologist, was like, what do we know that this came from? Well, it came from the potential for this. And I still like that. But I have a problem with it. I have a problem with just potential, let alone all potentials, because it feels like I'm looking to, if I'm going to put something at the beginning, whatever I put at the beginning, and I don't mean this necessarily in time, because maybe it goes back universes, but I mean metaphysically, the ground, if you will.
Yes.
Whatever I put at the ground, I can't explain. So, the whole problem with the religious worldview is you put God at the beginning. It's a pretty damn big thing to put at the beginning you haven't explained. My problem, even with my own worldviews that I've had in the past, is I've put things like consciousness or, awareness at the beginning. Also feels like a pretty damn big thing, because it turns often with that comes all sorts of little intentions and suddenly you've got God again. And so for me, it was like, look, what I've started this is what I'm exploring, Tony. It's all it is really. It's going, what's the simplest thing? Well, when I look at it, I think, well, this is the simplest quality that everything has is what you could call being. It's isness. So it feels like if there's a thing which we can put as the ground, the great name for it would be just simply being, which is an old philosophical idea, but that is in the process of becoming. There is.
Yeah, I'm with you on that.
Whereby, and what's the simplest thing? Well, you can take the Tao Te Ching or the Kabbalah or the Gnostics with their syzygies, and it's like, well, the one is two. And that's a mathematical statement. So you've got the idea of a bit, a yes-no, a piece of, what's the simplest information? Whereas John Wheeler, who we mentioned earlier, said, well, it's a yes-no.
It from bit, yeah.
It's a yes-no. So that's the simplest thing. So the nature of reality then becomes the one in relationship to itself, or the one as two. So it's a relationship. And everything has that quality then of relationship, everything. There's nothing.
But how does the one become two? You know, it's one of the kind of the deep philosophical questions, isn't it? You know, we're talking here things like the Orain Sof and everything
My
else.
answer
So
to that,
how does it become two?
my answer to that is it doesn't. And this is, of course, just a, it's no answer at all, really. But my own feeling is like it doesn't become two. It is two. That's the nature of what this is. The nature is this is the one in relationship to itself. That's what it is. It's not the one. That's nothing. It's the one in relationship to itself. That's what it is. And that it's in an emergent process of becoming, through which the information constantly builds on itself by interacting with itself, which is subject and object on every single level, right from the simplest to the most complex. And as it does, it emerges. And the thing which emerges from it isn't lesser. It's not like this is not real and really it's just digital. No, it's this. That has become this. And then this has become the psyche. And the psyche, in my view, is becoming God. That actually the whole thing is the universe coming to the most emergent thing possible. It's and that there's a growing evolution of everything based on what's been before. So that's why I say it's taken the Gnostic thing and put it on its head. It's like, no, rather than the emanation, which is this rather pessimistic view, which they understandably had of the fall down. So you fall from God and then the pleroma, and then that fucks up and you get the kenoma, and then blah, 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 until you see it. Oh God, how do we get home? Rather than that, the simplest thing you can imagine, which is the one in relationship to itself, emerging in ever more complex and emergent, more, not say it's not even necessarily more complex, but in the way that the past builds on what's been before, reaching greater and greater states of emergence until you've got life, until you've got psyche, until even I think you might be able to reach beyond that altogether and find the universe conscious of itself, not as where it's come from, but where it's going.
So would you define your model as being teleological then in its development? There is a plan,
No.
Or is it just accidental randomness?
I think it's what I want to try and avoid putting all these things at the beginning, because that feels like the problem. So I feel like the thing which is so compelling about the rather horrendous materialist reductionist vision of the world, why is it so compelling? Because it seems to match our experience on the levels it describes. Yes. So if you look at the evolution of the universe on the level it's described, it seems like, it's a meaningless, accidental universe. And even with the beginning of life, my pet fun example, just because it makes me laugh, is 250 million years of dinosaurs. I mean, if it's going, if it's heading towards this great vision, is like, really? And the brutality of nature and the horrendous suffering, all of the things which makes it impossible for me to put God at the beginning, because God at the beginning is the demiurge. He's a madman. He's a fuckwit. He's cruel. He's crazy. I don't like him. So I don't want him at the beginning. I don't think he's at the beginning. I don't think he exists at all. I think actually we're in a movement towards the greater, in which it's manifesting itself on greater levels, so that meaning and teleology can come in on a certain level. So with biology, you can maybe start talking about teleology, because organisms develop a telos. They want to become this. There's growth and development. There's also the desire to stay alive. You're getting all the things which will really come to fruition in the greater animals like ourselves. And then you've got the growth from that of the psyche, the imaginal realm, and now we've got story. And this is a really key idea for me, which plays into the ideas that we were talking about in terms of like meaning and the future. What I really want to play with, Tony, and I think you might get this, I don't know whether you'll agree with it, but I think you'll get it. Let's take the computer model, just because it's easy. My sense is the universe has evolved into a story. That it's become a story. And that's what we're in. That's what the psyche is. That's what it's in. It's all meaning, story. Things are related not through causality, but through resonance, through meaning, through narrative. And that exists on all these levels at once. So when I play my computer games with my kid, it's functioning as ones and zeros. It's functioning as machine code. And it's functioning as story. And all of those levels are seamlessly working together. And that existence as I'm experiencing it is the same, which is why if I look at the lower levels, it is relentlessly cause and effect. But actually, also, it's magical. And synchronicity happen. And there's meaning. And there's the whole imaginal experience and the daemon. And all of those things have emerged from it. And they exist now together, so that they're all happening at once, not one thing.
Because that's interesting. So going back to the computer analogy you used and the computer games that your children play, in that story comes from, at its basic level, it's digital information, and it's then honed into what your screen then designs, and everything else on the screen shows you an alternate place that you can actually inhabit and wander around in, supposedly a three-dimensional wandering around. But somebody has designed that. Somebody has designed the narrative. Somebody has already designed the story. In other words, the story has been designed by a computer software person. And then you exist within that story, which then suggests that if this is a story, and I might have misunderstood what you were meaning here, but if this is then a story, the story has to have a creator, has to have an author of some description, or is the story randomly just evolving within itself? It's just,
I think it's
happening.
Evolving within itself, but not randomly. So what a key idea for me is about the nature of time, and I don't mean time measurement like Einstein means. I mean time just as one thing follows another.
Yeah. Okay.
Causality, if you like, that everything builds on the thing that's happened before. So one of the key things for me is like, okay, so if everything builds, every moment builds on the moment before and must incorporate it, then all of the past is present, because all that information is here. Everything.
T.S. Eliot, the Four Quartets. All time past is in time present.
Yeah, it was, had a big influence on me. So for me, it's like I've changed the talking about the idea of time passing and talked about it accumulating, so that there's an accumulation. So time is expanding like space is expanding. That each new moment incorporates everything that's happened before, so that the amount of information is increasing. So I've started thinking. I mean, I think it was Peirce. Charles Sanders Peirce originally, Rupert Sheldrake has become famous for this idea of drop the laws of the universe, think about the habits of the universe. Lee Smolin, the physicist, is talking very similarly. The metaphor that I've started thinking of is the algorithms, which is an obvious borrow from computers, that what's happening is the information as it's accumulating is becoming the algorithms or the laws or the habits of nature, which govern how I move my hands, or how the microphone works, the laws of everything. The other name you could give for the same thing is the wisdom of nature. It's learning. It's a self-generating, self-learning thing, and that goes right the way up into the realm of narrative, where it's working on a completely different level, where you and I are interacting as stories, and that's really how we experience it, isn't it, Tony? When I started talking to you, it's like, oh, Tony, and then you, oh, well, I read your book, and it's all a story, because that's what matters to us, because this is the story of Tim making the story of Tony, and what you're meeting is everything I've ever been, and what I'm meeting is everything you've ever been. And then in our interaction, we're now different. Now this has happened, and this will always be part of us. So that kind of, and then we bring meaning, and it's not like we make the meaning up. We are the meaning. We are the level in which the universe creates meaning, and then we search for better meanings. So the meaning I had 10 years ago, it was pretty good at the time. This one's better, which is why I'm excited by it. It's not arbitrary.
Because it's the idea, isn't it? And I've heard it mentioned many times that the universe itself is using us to become self-aware of itself, and it's developing consciousness. And in this, I'm reminded of the writings of Philip K. Dick, which I did a biography of a few years ago. And of course, one of the central concepts that he wrote an incredible story called The Divine Invasion. And in it, there is a young man, I think he's called Manny, who is God, who's existing in California in the 1960s, but is blissfully unaware of the fact that he's God. And of course, we can take this back to the idea of the Platonic idea of anamnesis, you know, and the loss of forgetting, and that we, as singular emanations of a greater something, are unaware of the fact of what we are and what we are in the greater form of things. And that the universe, it was funny, I did an interview yesterday for another podcast, and one of the things we were discussing was this wonderment that we have as we're all on this trip, we're all discovering. And it's one of the things, I think it's fascinating talking to you, because I think we discussed this earlier on, that I very much come from a very materialist, reductionist worldview, and I need to understand how things work mechanistically, and that's why I go into the things like the simulation arguments and everything, because I come from that point of view, and I need the science to make me understand. And I've never been able to make that leap to saying, right, okay, let's go with instinct. It was something we were discussing. I'm not sure whether we were discussing it privately before we started, but this idea of this instinctive leap of faith, almost, to say, look, I need my daemon to lead me here. I need to just pull things together instinctively rather than pulling them together scientifically. And I still cling to those structures like crazy, and I don't want to pull myself away. But the things you're saying here are resonating with me, because I'm thinking, no, I can see where he's coming from in that viewpoint, because it's all a great mystery, isn't it? Everything is so intriguing.
Yeah, everything for me, I mean, I think you know this about me, Tony, but you know, everything for me, that's the foundation. The foundation is I don't know anything. And then from that, what can actually explain this best, and then find that and push it like mad and see if it falls over. And if it falls over, find something better. And if it doesn't fall over, keep going with it for now. And so the essential thing, I think, where I've been drawn is, what if what if we can say, look, the simple way of getting this, what this is, and is that it's the emergence, it's the realization of potentiality on ever more emergent ways. That's what it is. And when I look around me and I go, and all those ways are still there. I mean, there's quantum possibilities, can't see those, but I can see matter, and it's being matter-like, and it does certain things. And then there's biology and my plant there, and then there's psyche, this other thing which is not in space, not in material space, it's in its own space, which is all about meaning and narrative. And what if there's one narrative we can tell, which means that the scientific narrative, as it's developing, is not that far off for me up until biology. It's like it does really well with physics, very interesting. You know, I love it. And then biology, getting interesting. And then because of its reductionism, it wants to stop there and reduce everything really ultimately to physics. Whereas it feels like it itself, through the evolutionary story, has come up with a completely different perspective, which is emergent. That's it. It's created that. If we continue that and just go, you know, it doesn't end there. This realm in which you're thinking, the most important thing in your existence, is not a kind of epiphenomena.
Yes.
It's the most emergent level of reality. Of course it is. And it exists. And it's not, if you get an informational view, it's not difficult to say that, because the one I love is, if you look at the information you're receiving on a biological level, there's a monkey making funny noises right now. But the information you're hearing on an imaginal level is meaning.
Yes.
And it cannot be reduced to the funny noises. It just can't. It's more information.
And that is a phenomenally powerful analogy, I think, because one of the things that over the years, I mean, I've been fascinated by language, how language works, how it is that spontaneous sounds, as you say, sounds being made by a monkey effectively can resonate in my brain, and my brain can take those sounds and create ideas. You know, it's this wonderful concept of how this happens. And funnily enough, I was reading recently about the transition between Greek philosophy and Egyptian philosophy, and why Greek philosophy was different. And I'm particularly interested in the Eleusinian mysteries, and I'm particularly interested in Neoplatonism, and in fact, I should say the pre-Socratics, and very much the ideas of Greek philosophy. And there was this wonderful comment that was made, and I thought, what an incredibly clever way of seeing it. And it's the idea that effectively ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics are very much representational of the things they're discussing. So, you know, but funnily enough, a friend of mine, Sarah James, has shown me that that's not necessarily the case, that hieroglyphics actually had ideas within them, and they weren't just pictograms, they were deeper than that. But the ancient Greeks were the first to actually create a language in which the symbols represented sounds, like we do, you know, D-O-G, dog, but they're the sounds and the letters mean the sounds, which means that suddenly we associated a dog with something that was abstract, which was a symbol on a page. And it's suddenly a different way of seeing the world, and seeing the world in an abstract way. And when Plato then started spinning around with his forms and everything else as well. And it's how language structures, you know, I suppose you're aware of the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis of how language structures ideas and how the very words we use sort of almost creates the world around us. Because you were discussing earlier, you know, the qualia of red. And of course, the idea is that it is because we have a specific term red that particularly describes a particular form of the electromagnetic spectrum. But if we had a language that was different, I always use the analogy of indigo within the Newtonian idea of the rainbow. Of course, we can't differentiate indigo particularly well, but he needed it because he needed 7, because of course he was a mystic and he needed the sevens, so he needed the 7th colour. So he creates this colour, but now we see it. It's as if we now see it because our culture has decided this is now part of our reality scheme, and it exists out there.
So if we go back to the other thing we were talking about before, this feels like a nice little thing to draw back to. So that when I was going, look, this is the one in relationship to itself, and everything is a subject and everything is an object. And what reality is the emergence of that relationship. And I said, look, I don't think we need qualia, because what I'm looking at is the world. It's the information of the world as perceived by this level of biological information. That's what it perceives. And then it feels like, but what we didn't do was go on to the psyche. And then, of course, once you've got the psyche, now I'm not just seeing red, I'm seeing red on my house. And that's a whole narrative idea. That's my house, that's where I live, my daughter was born there, and then suddenly, and then like you said, and then if I can, you know, I'm looking out, I'm not a gardener, so I'm looking at the garden, I just see flowers. But if I was a gardener, I wouldn't see flowers, I'd see that flower and this and that. And so then you see, then the meeting then is not, there's the biological meeting, and then there's the soul meeting with the world, with the conceptual world. And what's lovely about why I love doing this is because you and I are connecting completely on that level, pretty much. Our bodies, I wave my hands, I have to, I don't know why. But where we're connecting is all on that non-material conceptual level, and we're passing conceptual information and responding, and they're making links.
Well, it's again, isn't it? One of the things in my new book, I discuss the concept of the egregorial, in terms of the egregorial as a kind of quasi-magical term, and also the egregorial as something that is a thought creation that is created by
Explain
people,
what that
like
means.
We're creating.
I'm fascinated by this, and I just want to be able to. This is an area I'm very pleased you brought up, because I want to talk to you about it. So explain exactly what you mean.
The egregorial is the idea, I think it was an idea that I first came across with the work of a guy called Mark Stavish, who is an American writer. And Stavish argues that there are thought forms that can be created by collective minds that become greater than the individuals in the group. You know, there was a very famous book written many years ago, and I must actually research who wrote it so I can actually cite the name of the person. But it was something I call the mass psychology of crowds. And the idea that you get a crowd of people together and they create something greater than the individuals within it. The crowd takes on its own psychology.
Yep.
Now, research has shown that in some occasions we can seemingly create almost external thought forms within external reality. I'm reminded of the experiments, the Toronto experiment that took place in the late 1970s, where these guys created this spirit, a kind of a spirit creature that they created. And of course we have the concept of tulpas and everything else, but there's also the idea of the way in which concepts take on a mind of their own, literally a mind of their own, like advertising. You know, there are certain advertising tropes that seem to be out there, but there's also when people talk like we're talking now, there seems to be something creative that's not Tim and it's not Tony, it's something greater.
Yeah.
And there's this kind of resonance, and we start to resonate in the same way.
Yeah.
And there's this sort of upswelling of something that it's almost tangible. Now, with some of the things you were saying earlier on, I kept thinking, yeah, I can see how I'm with you on that, and on that idea that somehow there's this kind of thought matter that rises up. And then if that is the case, from the point you were making before, is it that's why we see the world differently to other people? We discussed this, how in my group, how it is we are drawn together because we see the world in a similar way, and we are attracted to each other because we see the world in a different way. But are we then creating the world around us because of our collective ideas? And therefore everything we see reinforces, you know, it's almost like, you know, in psychology, they use the term, don't they, of when things take place and magical things take place, that it's somehow our attention bias. We look for things because our attention is looking for them. We see synchronicities because we're looking for them. They don't exist there in the reality, but our worldview is facilitating.
Those people have clearly not had many synchronicities.
Clearly not.
I mean, I think attention bias is definitely a reality. I'm sure we all notice that. That's definitely real. But I'm sure, well, you know, the people that I'm drawn to because of who I am, everyone experiences, oh my God, the most outrageous serendipity, synchroderapy. What was the lovely word?
Synchronipity.
Synchrondipities.
Yeah. Trademark.
Brilliant. I love it. Synchrondipities. So, you know, it's like, no, that's a desperate attempt again to reduce it, to get rid of what is a soul phenomena, a narrative phenomena. So the egregorials, there's something very interesting about this. There's lots of things I want to ask you. So when you said concepts take on a kind of like a life of their own, one of the things that's always struck me about, say, the ancient gods of Greece, for instance, is that they're really concepts. They're like justice. We're into justice. So and she looks like this, and you know I'm into music. So so I'm wondering whether that's a phenomena with the arising of the psyche as a objective sphere in its own right, the imaginal realm, whether information on that when we're focusing in on these primal concepts, aspirational concepts, often like justice or love, or that they take form and then by social convention develop a particular backstory and all the rest of it, and then start to have an identity, much like we might build a building.
Yeah,
that's the building. And
because in which case that would explain why people have subtly different worldviews. For instance, I'm not a religious person, so therefore the religious mindset is something I cannot understand. But there are people I know who are highly intelligent who are religious, and therefore in their world, their observations reinforce their beliefs because they see in things I don't see. But it doesn't necessarily mean they don't exist. It means that their egregorial world is subtly different to mine, and they see the world in it. Because, for instance, I find it fascinating, you know, on most street corners these days, you see Jehovah's Witnesses on every street corner, and they are so enthusiastic about the belief system that they must read a very different history of the Jehovah's Witness religion to the history I know of Jehovah's Witnesses, you know, and Charles Taze Russell and Rutherford and everybody else, and the various times that they've claimed that the world was about to end and it didn't. And they interpret that as very differently to the way I interpret it.
Yeah.
Which means we're all interpreting, we're all in these kind of subjective worlds.
But you're saying more than that, aren't you, Tony? With this egregorial, it feels like that can be that insight, which is definitely deep and real, and for all of us, the necessity to doubt, to be able to unpick your world and look out from it and see something from other people's perspective, how important that is, how difficult, but how important it is, how exciting too. But that could be understood in terms of a conceptual framework, but that could be individual. But what's interesting about what you're exploring here, as I understand it, is the idea that there's an objective quality which can arise maybe for you individually in terms of a figure in your own imagination, but also collectively. So we have collective figures. the archetypes of Jung, for instance, maybe very basic ones.
Totally. Yes.
And that therefore these things are populating the collective imaginal realm. So, and whether actually that's happening all the time. For instance, you and I have just met. Not just met, but just had this conversation. Now, if we entertain some of the ideas which we've shared so far, that we can understand everything is emergent information, then the information which has existed mainly on imaginal level of our conversation still exists. It's now part of the backstory. It's part of the past. And that therefore the imaginal information that we hold collectively is in some small way different. And that other people's responses will be different for our conversation. Just in the way of, I'm sure you must get it. I get it all the time. Where I realize I've had an idea completely independently decades after somebody else, and my sense of gratitude of, oh, you helped me have this idea. We've never met, but somehow you clearing a space, and my own aspiration for my own life and death is that, I can't probably have that much effect on the world, but maybe I can clear some ideas away and a route through that others will stumble upon completely independently because I have done my work. And there's some delight in that.
That's a very interesting idea. And one of the things that we were discussing again before we started was about why we write and why we do this. And I have that same feeling that at some stage in the future, somebody will come across my writing and say, that's a really interesting idea. I'm going to run with that, as if we're kind of seeding the future, as if we are giving information to other people to carry it forward in some way. And again, the idea of the egregorial, I think, really fascinates me in the sense it seems to be like almost creating thought forms. Because, it's the idea, it's almost going back, isn't it, to, again, the Platonic forms, the idea that there is out there in the egregorial realm, in the pleroma, there are these ideal types that exist. And we see them within these three-dimensional realities, but they're kind of pale reflections of something that's far more interesting and unique. Now, I love that idea. I just love the idea that somehow we are not coming up with ideas, we're excavating them. I used the example once when I was writing my first book, I felt that I was digging a hillside and finding things in the hillside and pulling them together. And I used the analogy, I felt like I was Frederick Schliemann at the hill of Hissarlik, discovering the very different levels of Troy. And you suddenly pick something out and you think, oh, that's really fascinating, but you can't put it in context. And it's only when you dig deeper that suddenly that relates to that. And you suddenly think, oh, wow, these are the things. And we need other people and debates and discussions like this to help us do that. And that's why this has been such a wonderful conversation. I hope other people see that when they listen to this.
I completely get that kind of spatial analogy for thinking, because you mentioned T.S. Eliot, and I can distinctly remember being with Peter Gandy, that I wrote all the Jesus mysteries with and all those books, and it would become a common thing for us. But it was like, hang on, we'd have some insight about the nature of existence or the work we were doing. And one of us would say, oh, T.S. Eliot stood on this hill. Oh, yeah, so he has.
Wow.
This is what he was describing. Oh, yes, so it is. Or Walt Whitman's been here. Look, Walt was here. It's like, yeah, so it is. This is where they came to.
Yeah, it's when you discover, isn't it, that you think you've come up with these incredibly original ideas, and you realize that the metaphysical poets were writing about them in the 17th century.
Yeah.
I mean, my favorite line of poetry, which I put up on my Facebook wall and my Instagram wall a couple of days ago, because I just love it. It's the William Wordsworth lines written a few miles above Tintern Abbey. Where the line where he says, in the sight of setting suns, I have seen something intangible. The idea that we sometimes, and I don't know about you, but sometimes I feel that you're touching upon something incredible, but you haven't got the language to verbalize it, and you haven't. And this is why your point of coming at it from instinct sometimes works, because you cannot explain it. You can't put words to it, but it's there. And sometimes when my group and we meet, and we all chatter away like mad like this, and we'll do it for 2 or 3 hours, and I walk away and I'm high for hours afterwards. I'm feeding off the
Yeah.
egregorial energy
Yeah. Yeah.
of the group.
Yeah.
You know, and I just wish the rest of humanity had that kind of sense of excitement and wonderment about the world. The idea, as Socrates said, that, you know, the more I know, the less I know. But because I discover the less I know, that excites me. It doesn't make me feel down. It makes me feel, wow, the only thing I worry about is how many years have I got left to discover all these other wonderful things. Because the world is, I wander around in awe all the time. I just do, you know, and the more books I read, the more ideas I come across, the more I think, wow, isn't in the intellectual world just so exciting? You know, talking about ideas is everything, isn't it? You know.
Tony, I think that you just brought us to the best possible conclusion I can possibly imagine for this conversation. You just summed up, and also I think managed to excuse us for heading off in so many different directions that we never followed, because both of us suffer from the same obsessions and
Totally.
love of these ideas, and so each one leads to another. And yeah,
you know, we've discussed this before. We've got to do the Peake and Freke show.
Peake
we
and
just
Freke
have to,
show,
just
yeah.
for the sound. It works so well.
So yes, I love your mind. It's been a beautiful experience connecting with it, and all the things that you've discovered and all the things that you are exploring. And it's been great to share some of the ones.
And yours, but remember that I would not be here without reading your book.
That is so. That is a wonderful thing to know.
Wonderful.
So
Wonderful to talk to you, Tim. Absolutely
right.
Fantastic. Thank you.